The situation on Crimea has been absolutely devastating for over a month now, but despite that, the situation still manages to get worse and worse every single day, to the point that the peninsula is quickly becoming uninhabitable for human life, and certainly for modern human life. And that might sound dramatic, but it is absolutely true, and the recent developments that have happened there have shocked even me. Just yesterday, I saw an updated receipt from a Crimean gas station, where somebody purchased gasoline at a price that was equivalent to approximately $22 per gallon, or approximately €5 per liter. To put it another way, to fill a 20-gallon tank in Crimea would cost the equivalent of $440. And that would be devastating anywhere on the planet, even in the United States. But it's especially devastating for Russians, who on average, if they're lucky, might earn approximately 1/8 of the average US salary. Now, the class of Russians that can afford to go to Crimea to take vacations in the first place, they might be a little bit better off, and they might earn 1/3 of the average US salary if they're lucky. But it doesn't really matter no matter how you slice and dice it. This fuel is incredibly expensive. For many Russians, to purchase a single tank of gasoline on the peninsula of Crimea would now cost them well over their entire monthly wages, not counting that they would also, of course, have to buy food and shelter and everything else. It has literally become too expensive to live and to operate on Crimea. And gasoline is this expensive for those who are even able to get it in the first place, which isn't most people. And while this is the most exaggerated instance of fuel shortages in all of Russia, these fuel shortages are spreading to other regions as well, even in mainland Russia, where gasoline prices in some cases have eclipsed $15 per gallon, again, if you're lucky to get it. At these prices, it is literally worse for you to actually drive to work and work than it is to just sit home and do nothing and earn no wages. And so because of that, many Russians are beginning to do exactly that. They are not bothering to go to work, and that's especially true on the peninsula of Crimea. That has far-ranging repercussions that perhaps I'll analyze in a full-length video on its own, because it actually starts to break down the fabric of society in specific areas. It starts to break down the economy at a level that's far deeper than just heavily increased fuel prices. But in any case, Crimea is becoming uninhabitable. People there cannot afford to go to work, and that's a pretty crazy thing to say when you cannot actually even afford to spend your time working for someone else. But it turns out that as bad as this is far from the worst of the problems that the people on Crimea are facing. And in fact, it's gotten so bad that we're starting to see reports that government officials have either already fled Crimea or they have specific plans in place to flee Crimea because they know it's essentially a lost cause. All of this, of course, sounds bad already, and we haven't even begun to discuss the electricity problems, the food problems, and the water problems, which I'll get into in just a minute later in this video. But before we do that, I need to emphasize that even the fuel crisis itself is just beginning, and it's about to get a whole lot worse. Because over the past couple of days, there has been a massive development. In my opinion, one of the biggest developments of the entire war in Ukraine, where Ukraine has now forced Russian maritime traffic to abandon the Sea of Azov. And again, this is something that sounds like dramatic language or clickbait, but it is not. That is precisely exactly what has actually happened. Because over the past several days, Ukraine has just shot down and disabled so many different Russian vessels, primarily vessels that were transporting food and fuel to the peninsula of Crimea. That number, by the time I'm recording this video, will probably have eclipsed 100 vessels, and if it doesn't, it's because Russia actually banned additional vessels from entering that sea. They literally gave up on it. You're not allowed to enter it from mainland Russia, from the riverine connections that connect to the Sea of Azov to Russia's river and canal system, by which these vessels typically load the fuel and food that they will take to the Crimean Peninsula. But you're also not allowed to enter the Sea of Azov from the south anymore, where Russia is no longer taking new applications for ships to transit through the Kerch Strait. An entire sea, the sea between Ukraine and Russia, has essentially become a wasteland. And that's a big problem for Crimea going forward. Because until these ships were being taken offline, they were one of the few ways that bulk fuel could actually make it to the peninsula. Over the past month, of course, we've been talking a lot about how Ukraine has been systematically destroying all of the land and bridge connections between mainland Russia and the Crimean Peninsula. And Ukraine has just been so effective here. They've not only taken out bridges multiple different times, but perhaps more importantly, they've been striking every fuel truck they can reach as it transits a long highway towards Crimea, to the point that this highway is now just littered with destroyed Russian fuel trucks. Russia, in most cases, isn't even bothering to remove the trucks because it's so dangerous, and Ukraine has now reached the point where they are destroying these trucks faster than Russia can actually replace them. But that's a whole topic in and of itself. That was already incredibly effective. That's what caused these fuel shortages we saw in the first place, to the point that they've now reached today. But while all of this was going on, Russia still had these fuel tankers coming in as kind of a last resort. They couldn't carry much in the first place, but it was one of the few things that Russia still had when it came to Crimea, and now that's over as well. And I would say that Ukraine's campaign, as effective as we thought it was going to be, had already been more effective than most people even projected before this move took place. So the situation is going to become truly dire. It will probably become literally impossible for Russia to get any fuel onto the Crimean Peninsula. Not just no fuel for civilians, but probably no fuel for the government either. No fuel for the fire crews, no fuel for the military. The peninsula has become undefendable when you cannot bring fuel to the peninsula. But as I said, this fuel crisis is just the beginning of Crimea's problems. Because increasingly, we have also been seeing problems when it comes to Crimea's electricity and water shortages. When it comes to electricity, similar to the fuel shortages, Crimea has already had problems for the past month. And those problems have progressively gotten worse and worse and worse and worse. But just like the fuel shortages have now reached a new level of bottleneck, so have the electricity problems. Because Ukraine just reached a point with the electricity too, where things will only get worse for the people of Crimea at a faster pace. One of the things Ukraine has been doing is they have been systematically taking offline all of the electrical substations across Crimea. And in the first week of July alone, Ukraine took offline 50 of those, which is dramatic. Crimea is actually not that large of a peninsula. But even more than that, they recently also severed the electrical connection between mainland Russia and Crimea. So Russia can no longer send electricity to the peninsula from the mainland. And just to give you a taste of how bad this can get, already in northern Crimea before this happened, we had reports that people were without electricity entirely for 7 days, an entire week. The network just was not able to come back online. In other parts of Crimea, particularly the bigger cities, they have had some electricity, but it has been few and far between. They've been trying a system of rolling blackouts where we can't generate that much electricity, so we're going to give a couple hours of electricity to each particular area so that people can still charge their devices, do what they need to do before they go back off the grid. That can help quite a bit. But those supposedly rolling blackouts have actually just become very rare instances of having electricity in the first place. Some people will say the electricity only came on once in several days. And people, in order to charge their phones, are now having to go to city centers where there are generators running just so people can charge their low-power devices. It's pretty dramatic, and that's a big deal. In Crimea, of course, it's getting hot. It's the middle of summer. But also Crimea needs the electricity in the winter because it can get rather cold. And so without an electrical grid and without fuel, you got a big problem. You are an unempowered society. You're essentially a third world country, or actually worse. Because at least in third world countries, people are typically used to living without these amenities. They're used to living without electricity. Not so the case for the people on Crimea. They are used to living in a particular way. They don't exactly know how to adapt, but now they're being forced to. And when it comes to electricity, electricity isn't just a problem in and of itself, but on Crimea in particular, no electricity means no water for a lot of people. The peninsula operates on water pumps. Its main water supply was cut off a long time ago when Russia destroyed a dam that actually allowed water levels to be high enough to feed a canal that went from mainland Ukraine down into Crimea. And so ever since then, Crimea has had some water shortages, but that's been mostly agricultural. For drinking water, that's typically been solvable through water pumps. And Crimea also needs water pumps, not just because they need to pump water in general, but because they have a rather dense population in many of the cities that are there. Rather than having like single-family homes, it's mostly higher-rise buildings. And we're now hearing that there's just not enough electricity, even when the electricity is on, to power these water pumps to actually pump the water to the upper floors. This is becoming a big problem. A lot of the upper floor apartments or hotel rooms that people are dwelling in because they can't escape the peninsula now have no access to water. And so this is a peninsula with no fuel, no electricity, and no water again already, and all of those problems are about to get much worse. But these are not the only problems that Crimea is having. Crimea is also now having problems when it comes to food. So when it comes to the grocery stores on Crimea, this does seem like one area where Vladimir Putin has legitimately accomplished his aims for this war. And that is that Vladimir Putin wanted to invade and capture Ukrainian territory to bring it back to the glory days of the former Soviet Union or the former Russian Empire. And in a Crimean grocery store, he has really done just that. Because it really is like a classic Soviet grocery store. Empty shelves everywhere, rationing everywhere, and if you can get stuff, the price is pretty extreme. In the grocery stores in Crimea right now, there is increased rationing of staples, and you, I hear, are not able to get a lot of things beyond the staples, and it's decreasing all the time. Russia is afraid that people will panic and will stockpile things. So they're limiting what people can purchase at the same time that people don't have fuel for their cars. So you can't drive to the grocery store and stock up. You have to walk to the grocery store every couple of days to get whatever it is you need. Now, that's not the end of the world in and of itself. It's a solvable problem. Right now, they still have the staples. But what is a problem is the fact that the prices in the store can no longer be trusted. We're getting reports that sometimes you will go and pick up an item off the shelf, and when you take it to the register, well, they've increased the price to double what it was at the time they put it on the shelf. And there's actually signs saying, hey, don't trust the prices on the shelves. The register will have the final price. This is like a hyperinflation scenario, localized, but it is like a hyperinflation scenario where you literally cannot update the price signage fast enough to keep up with the actual price changes. That is something that could quickly spiral out of control, especially when fuel prices are already so high that people can't afford to go to work. Now, as if all of this wasn't already bad enough, there's also now another parallel crisis that will make this even worse. And that is that the entire peninsula of Crimea is now running out of cash. This is happening for a couple of different reasons. First of all, Crimea is a tourist hotspot. And so as tourists come in, they might withdraw cash and then they might go home with it. But in this case, people are able to leave Crimea, but people aren't able to get back in to replenish the cash stockpiles. And I would speculate maybe the banks are a little afraid of sending an armored vehicle with millions of dollars worth of cash to the peninsula of Crimea to refill their stocks. At the same time, the Crimean economy is increasingly becoming a black market economy, where people are, for example, acquiring fuel with their rations, and they're selling it to others at extremely inflated, marked up prices. And of course, if you're going to do that transaction, you're only going to do that in cash. So people are withdrawing their cash from the banks in order to make that happen. And at the same time, because of all the electricity shortages, you can't exactly trust the card system to run your card to pay for a transaction. And so it's become basically a cash economy. All of this together then has the potential to become a different kind of financial disaster, where the peninsula as a whole just doesn't have enough cash to keep the economy flowing at any scale. Already at a normal scale, the cash flowing into the peninsula wouldn't be enough, but you also have to keep in mind that normal scales don't apply here because everything on the peninsula has become so much more expensive if you can even get it in the first place. People need access to more cash than ever before, but they're actually getting access to less cash. Just as an example, a Russian state bank that's on the peninsula, the one with the most ATMs, has drastically reduced their withdrawal limits. They used to be approximately the equivalent of 4,000 US dollars per month, or about 2,000 US dollars per day. Those limits have been reduced drastically to about $700 total per month, or about $200 total per day. And that is really, really bad. That is not enough cash if you do the math, even if you can get your hands on fuel, to even be able to pay for all of that fuel in the first place. It's also the same for groceries. And when you combine them both together, plus everything else, you realize even if people technically have the money, they may not actually have the cash to be able to clear those transactions in the first place. And so Crimea will descend, and in fact, in many ways has already descended, into a form of barter economy, where there's very limited goods, and the goods that are there, well, nobody's going to take your cash. They're going to want something in return, another form of goods. Russia, if nothing else, is extremely good at keeping their society in the Middle Ages, despite all pressures from the outside trying their best to help them improve. And in this way, Crimea, this is why I say it has become an uninhabitable peninsula. Can some people scrape by? Sure, of course they can. People live like that all over the world. But from the perspective of the peninsula as a whole, when your entire economy, when your entire region runs out of food, and it runs out of fuel, and it runs out of water, and it runs out of electricity, and it even runs out of cash, where do you go from there? Of course, the answer is you go anywhere but there. And so a lot of Russians have already begun to flee the peninsula of Crimea. And that number, I can guarantee you, is only going to increase. Now, in this situation, Vladimir Putin really has no good options, and however you slice and dice it, this is a massive defeat for him. On one hand, any responsible government would see the situation and they would start ordering citizens to leave that area and to evacuate. This has become a war zone. Wars make regions uninhabitable. If we can't protect you there, we need you to leave the region. But of course, Russia is not a responsible government. And doing that would be admitting something. Telling people to leave the peninsula would be an admission that Russia had lost. And that would spread the crisis beyond Crimea itself, from Putin's perspective, into the minds of the average Russians. And so Putin, for the most part, is remaining quiet. In fact, what he's saying is, well, maybe we can provide some subsidies for the people in Crimea to help them with the ever-increasing costs. But a subsidy doesn't help you if the good doesn't exist there on the peninsula in the first place. The government can entirely subsidize and pay for all of my food and fuel and housing, but if the housing and the food and the fuel doesn't exist, the government subsidy is worthless. So Putin is trying to project power and calm to the Russian population at large because he's afraid of admitting there's a problem on Crimea, and that's only going to make the problem on Crimea worse. For example, the reason that Ukraine has been able to shoot down or disable so many of these tankers in the Sea of Azov, causing the Sea of Azov to be closed, is because these tankers were all waiting in queue to deliver fuel to Crimea. And to deliver fuel to Crimea is a task that could take over a day at a time. And so you have tankers that aren't going to be able to deliver fuel for a week at least because there's so many of them waiting in queue. But Putin clearly ordered this to happen so that something could be done. He panicked and he lost. So Putin has no good options here. He can't admit that he has a problem, but the more he doesn't admit he has a problem, the worse the problem actually gets. And eventually the problem will bite him in the butt. Right now we are seeing citizens fleeing Crimea. And while Putin may try to control the narrative as much as he possibly can, these people are going to tell the truth. They're going to tell their fellow Russians about what they experienced, even if they're not doing so to try to talk down on the government, Even if they do so, saying, look how horrible the Ukrainians are for doing this to us, their experiences are still going to be shared, and those experiences are going to be inconsistent with what Putin promised to the Russian people. So this is a massive loss. Russia is going to have an internal migrant crisis as people flee this peninsula. And as they flee, a lot of these migrants are going to land right in these areas of Russia where people are perhaps more inclined to actually rebel against the Russian government and to not be as loyal. For example, this is all going to land near the Caucasus area, which, of course, if you know anything about Chechnya and the Chechen wars and the Caucasus in general, this has been an area that traditionally has not been very loyal to Vladimir Putin. If we look even at Rostov-on-Don, this is the place that Yevgeny Prigozhin arrived with his Wagner coup, and nobody stood up to resist him. The people were kind of just eating their popcorn, waiting to see what would happen. They might have not been directly rebellious against the government, but they certainly weren't super supportive of the federal government in Moscow to be so patriotic as to do something about this. This then shows you that these regions, when they start receiving all these internal migrants from Russia, who are telling them the truth, but also putting pressure on their own economies, as even in Rostov, they have extremely high fuel prices now, you realize how bad this could become for Vladimir Putin. It's a crisis that he can't manage. He cannot admit to defeat, but at the same time, the defeat is real. And you realize here that Ukraine doesn't have to be in a rush to do anything. This could be Ukraine's goal in and of itself. Just keep pressuring the Crimean Peninsula and see what happens to Russia internally as a result of all of this. Will it win the war for them? Not in and of itself, but it certainly won't make Russia look very good. But what's really interesting is something that Ukraine just did today. Something that I've been talking about for years that Ukraine would have the potential to do eventually, and now the first proof of concept has finally happened. In a place called the Kinburn Spit, Ukraine just accomplished a world first in the entire history of human warfare. And that is that they just landed a ground robot, a UGV, that was piloted to the Kinburn Spit by a naval drone. This is an amphibious landing conducted entirely not by humans, but by robots, meaning that Ukraine has the ability, once they scale this up, this proof of concept, to conduct amphibious landings without risking human lives. This is a game changer. And for years I've said that eventually Ukraine would reach this point, and if they got Crimea softened up before that they could use precisely this tactic to actually take back the Crimean Peninsula from the Russians without taking massive human casualties, without taking casualties that they simply couldn't sustain. This is no longer just theory. This is now a matter of timing, because all the pieces are now on the board. We talked about these pieces years ago, and people said Ukraine couldn't do it. They couldn't pressure Crimea, and they couldn't get the robots to be able to do that type of a mission. Now they've proven that they can do both. Crimea is going to get weaker over time. Ukraine's robotic capabilities are going to get stronger over time. And I would not be surprised if in a year or two, we see a softened Crimea being occupied by thousands and thousands of ground robots. This is a new age of warfare. This is warfare unlike anything we've seen in human history, but at the same time, it has parallels to time-proven tactics that have been successful many times throughout human history. And Russia seems now almost certain to lose Crimea to Ukraine. Will it happen tomorrow? Not necessarily, and it doesn't have to. Ukraine has all the time it needs, and all it has to do is keep putting on the pressure and be patient. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please do us both a favor by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps me out a lot, it boosts the channel in the YouTube algorithm, and it's free. But it also helps you because it means you'll be recommended more videos just like this one. So if you enjoyed this video, that'll ensure you see more content just like it. Now, if you really enjoy the channel, as always, do consider becoming a supporter of the channel as a patron or a YouTube channel member. Your guys' support makes what I do here possible, where I'm posting videos almost on a daily basis now here on YouTube for free. Thanks again for watching. I look forward to seeing you guys on the next video.